Welcome back to the channel. What you're looking at here is the Galaxy S20 and the Galaxy S10. And if you're looking into the S20, you might have realized by now that the S10 was released at a similar price, has a pretty similar shape, but is now drastically cheaper. So in this video, I want to compare these two head to head to see what the trade-offs are if you're buying the S10 versus the S20 and why you might want to choose one versus the other. And I want to compare these in 5 different categories. The first one is just the physical differences, because there are quite a few despite being overall the same shape. Then number 2 is the displays, which do have some pretty substantial differences. 3 is the camera arrangement, which is probably the biggest difference between these phones, and there's a lot to cover there. I'll also give you some testing on that. Then number 4, I want to talk about the electronics, the internals of these phones, and lastly, the software differences between these phones. So starting off, let's talk about the physical aspects of these phones, and I think the first one that you'll notice is actually how you turn the phone on. So they rearranged the buttons on these, sort of for good and for bad, depending on how you look at it. So the S20 here has a single side key right there, which is your on button. It is also, if you double tap it, you can open your camera or an app. And if you triple tap, that is your SOS. Then above that, you have the rocker for volume. Now the S10 had an extra button on there where on the right side, first we have our regular power key, double tap it to open the camera, triple tap for an SOS. And then on the left side, we had the Bixby key, which they no longer have on the S20. And that was mainly to summon Bixby, but something nice about it was you could also summon whatever app you wanted. So you can open Snapchat with this key, open your camera with the other key, whereas on the S20, you do have to choose between if you want to open your camera or some other app. Then of course the volume rocker is also on the left side, which does actually mean that screenshots were also easier with the S10. Now that's not to say you can't take screenshots with the S20, it just means it's a little trickier to do that with one thumb, and maybe instead you're going to be doing palm swiping or one of the many gestures you can do to actually take a screenshot with this phone. Now, speaking of screen, you actually have a pretty big difference at the top of the screen right there, where the hole punch camera on the S20 is now in the center versus on the right side, and it is much, much smaller. So I think this is a huge improvement for the S20, where you can obviously see the difference right there. It's way less intrusive, and it's also, I think, in a better location where it's not blocking a normal spot for icons. Instead, it's in the middle where there's normally not really anything there anyway. And looking right above that, you'll see the ear speaker for when you're talking on the phone is significantly smaller, and it was already small before, but now it's just a tiny slot. You can barely even see it. And while we're up there looking at the top, the SIM tray is actually not really different, but you can have more storage expandable on this phone. So before, you could go up to 512 gigabytes on the regular S10. Now you can go up to 1 terabyte with the S20. So now flipping the phone over, you'll see the back. They both have a solid color. I'll pop up the colors on the screen right here. It's a small difference, but you know, there's different colors for different models here. And the camera bump is a huge difference. Now, not only is it a different shape and different location, but they also removed the heart rate sensor. So they used to have a heart rate sensor on the S10 and the previous models. Now they removed that. They realized, I guess a lot of people are starting to get more wearables like sport bands or smartwatches or other things to really kind of take your heart rate for you. And on top of that, you'll notice that the camera bump is a little bit larger, a little bit more in the Z direction right there when you're looking at how far it sticks out. And not to say the camera bump is necessarily worse on the S20, but one thing that is a subtle difference here is if you set the S10 down on a table, it doesn't have any kind of rock or wobble, whereas the S20 does kind of wobble back and forth, which really only matters if you don't have a case and if you're trying to write on your phone. So maybe if you're like signing something on your phone or drawing, that's the only time you'll really notice that. On the bottom of the phone, you'll see that the S10 did actually come with a headphone jack, whereas the new one does not. The S20 is only slightly heavier, coming in at 163 grams versus 157, and I think that may be in part due to the larger battery on the S20, which is 4,000 milliamp hours versus the 3,400 on the S10. So I realized based on the first category, it may sound like the S10 is almost a better phone, but I think once we get into the second category of screens, you'll really start to see where the S20 starts to take off and really flex what it's been made to do. So the first thing that is different about the screens, of course, is the size being 6.2 inches versus 6.1 inches. And you'll see that a lot of it, even though the phone itself is not really much bigger, a lot of it is that they trim down the bezels. And of course, it also looks bigger because the hole punch camera is as well smaller. Now the screen is 3200 by 1440, whereas the S10 was 3040 by 1440. So you do have a few more pixels on the new one. The ultrasonic fingerprint sensor was also moved up a little bit, and I think it's a much more natural location for it. I find myself flexing my hand down less, and it just feels like that's where it really should be when you're trying to sign in with your fingerprint. And I didn't even get to the biggest one, which is the refresh rate of the screen. So previously it was 60 Hertz, which if you haven't used 120 Hertz, you might say that's fine. But I promise once you start using 120 Hertz here, you'll notice that it's just so much smoother. It's just way easier you're swiping around, your phone just feels faster, and it's just a lot more responsive, which on top of that, the touch sensitivity is also more responsive. It's now doubled to 240 Hertz. So if you're playing games or otherwise just want your phone to be very responsive, it definitely is a little bit better now. And then these both have dynamic AMOLED screens, but it is slightly improved with the S20. And on top of that, you might notice that it definitely does not kind of fall over the edge as much. So not nearly as much of the curved screen on the edges as we saw with the S10. Hey guys, a quick aside, if you're new here and have not yet subscribed, but you're interested in these phones or other tech videos like this one, please consider going down and clicking the subscribe button and the bell icon. I'll be making more videos about these phones to help you learn more about them. All right, so the next category is a tough one because there are so many changes here, and I promise I'll show you guys examples and we'll really test it out and see which one's better. But the cameras are very different on these phones. Obviously, the S20 has some really big improvements like 8K video, a 64 megapixel camera, pro video mode, single take mode, and a few other things like that. But looking at one camera at a time, the selfie camera is kind of almost the same actually. And I think the aperture was slightly larger before. Of course, it was a larger lens on there, so it makes sense that it was a larger aperture, but that just means it's a little bit better in low light. Now looking at the back then, the ultra wide actually is also interesting that it was in a way better on the old lens where it was 3 degrees wider, so more ultra wide, and also 16 megapixels versus 12 megapixels on the new one. Realistically, 16 versus 12, they're both, a reasonable picture. So the wide angle lens, your main shooter for most of your photos, is actually pretty different here. So they used to have a dual aperture, which was 1.5 and 2.2, which you would think would be better in low light when they're using 1.5. Now it's just 1.8, which is still a good aperture, and they were both 12 megapixels. Now it's 2 degrees wider field of view, so you should not really see a whole lot of a difference there. Now those three lenses almost sound similar, and they sound like they haven't really upgraded much, but where you really see this S20 being light years ahead is with the telephoto lens. Now, previously the telephoto lens was 12 megapixels, which the new one is now 64 megapixels, a massive improvement there, but kind of with one little catch. So the previous one, the field of view was 45 degrees, so it's definitely a true optical 2x zoom. You were really zoomed in on things. Whereas the new one, they say 3x hybrid optical zoom, which it's kind of more like 1.2 optical zoom, and then after that it's all kind of digital zoom. So it still can zoom in really far. It can actually zoom into 30x, and I'll test that out in a second, versus the S10, which can only zoom into 10x, but it's not always a true optical zoom. Now, with that being said, I don't think it necessarily matters. 12 megapixels of optical zoom, 64 megapixels digital zoom, you still get a better image with the 64 megapixel sensor there. So overall, I would say the S20 is significantly better with photos in my opinion, and as far as video goes, it also just blows the S10 out of the water here. Shooting 8K is really an incredible thing you can do on a phone, and the stabilization, not in 8K for regular 4K videos, is really, really good. So if you're taking videos and you're shaky, you don't have excessive warping and things just look really stable. So I think it does an excellent job of that. Okay, so you can see with super steady on with both of these, I can shake this around a lot, jump, I can like run, and they honestly both look pretty good, but I'd say the S20 is definitely a lot better. The next category, the internals, the electronics of these phones, the S20 just really crushes the S10 in this category. And it starts with, pretty much everything. The processor is a substantially better processor, having the Snapdragon 865 versus the 855. You can see it's just much faster. And then on top of that, it has more RAM. So we have 12 gigabytes versus 8. So 1.5 times more means that, I mean, you can have more apps open. You can just do a lot more with this phone. If you're using Samsung DeX for like a laptop type thing or a desktop, then it should also be more capable with that extra RAM. Connectivity, 5G comes pretty standard. I mean, if you're in Europe, you can get the LTE version, but at least in the US, the standard version is 5G. And granted, it's not millimeter wave 5G, but it's still sub 6 gigahertz, which is faster than LTE. Then, like I said before, the expandable storage on the S20 is essentially doubled. You're able to have 1 terabyte with an SD card in there versus 500 gigabytes on the S10. And then lastly, of course, there are many more small, subtle upgrades, but the last big one is the charging. So in the box, it comes with a super fast charger. That's 25-watt charging. Yes, it's a bigger battery, but you can still charge this phone really, really quickly. So lastly, I want to get into the software, and I'm going to tread lightly on this topic because software, of course, is subject to change. So depending on when you're watching this, they may be rolling out updates and bringing features down to the S10. But, you know, at the time of release right now, from what I'm seeing with both of these phones, is that you do actually have quick share now on the S20, which is pretty nice if you have another Galaxy phone in the area. So like 2 S20s in the same room right now, you could just send photos pretty quickly, kind of the equivalent of airdropping, but for Samsung phones. So it's nice to have that. You also have AR Zone on this. It also has Google Duo integration. So if you go to messages, you type in a number or you find a contact, you can just tap on that and have a video chat right there. Again, competing with FaceTime on Apple. There's message categories, so you can categorize like your family messages together, your coworkers together. There is also better integration with Bixby with Spotify and Netflix now, so you can tell it to play a song on Spotify, and it works really well. You can also incorporate that in Bixby routines. And then, of course, being that this is running the newest Android, this also has the live transcribe that Google was talking about so much with their Pixel 4. So that was a lot to talk about in this video, and unfortunately, I'm sure that's not the entirety of the differences between these phones. There are many more subtle differences here and there, but overall, those are the ones that I found were most important. So when it comes down to it, which one is a better phone for you to buy? I think it depends on what you're looking for. If you're on a tighter budget, if you really want a heart rate sensor, if you really want a headphone jack, I mean, you can get an adapter, of course, but if you really wanted a headphone jack, and lastly, if you really liked having a Bixby key, then I think the S10 is your obvious choice there. But for pretty much everybody else, if you're not on that tight of a budget, I think that it really justifies the upgrade for the S20. I mean, it costs more money, but the amount of features they packed in and the amount of upgrades they made, for me personally, I think it's worth it. So comment down below and let me know what you guys think of these two phones. Which one's better? Which one's worth your money? And why? So as always, guys, thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.